So, hi everyone, I'm here with Graham Norris today. Graham's an organisational psychologist, futurist, and speaker. Graham, thanks very much for joining me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Chris. Really looking forward to the conversation today.
So, you do a lot of work, and we came across each other sort of when you were doing a presentation, really thinking about the future and particularly how we start to think about the future. And I suppose just taking a step back, it feels like there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment. Certainly, that's what I pick up. Obviously, you're out in the industry speaking with people. What are you picking up in terms of like how are people feeling about the future at the moment?
Sure, there's a lot of people, as is always the case. We shouldn't forget there are always waves of change, and throughout history, there have
Mm,
been various advancements that have left people feeling a little bit uncertain about the future. And so now people are definitely not feeling more certain than they were before. But I think we have people who are leaning into it, leaning into the future, particularly those who are, involved in technology and those industries that are growing and expanding and advancing very quickly. And also some people feeling a little bit more unsure of themselves, those in industries which are a little bit more likely to be influenced by those growing industries,
mm.
people in the legal services or accountancy or those kinds of things. Even in oil and gas transitions there's a lot of things going on. Yeah, a lot of people having different experiences, which is unsurprising as technology advances. It advances at different paces and different areas. So people will experience that in different ways. And I think the responses to that are what's interesting. We see some unhealthy responses and some healthy ones. The unhealthy ones are probably things such as more binary thinking. And I think we've seen the trend towards that, particularly over the past decade. People, when you get increasing complexity in particular, people will gravitate towards simplicity, which often means binary options, things are black and white. We see that in terms of building a wall or leaving the European Union or
Mm.
these kinds of things. It will start to get a little bit more tribal as we try to simplify and understand an increasingly complex environment.
Yeah. So as uncertainty goes up, then our focus becomes much more sort of short term rather than long term. And is that and then we get into that kind of like binary kind of thinking in terms of we're going to go this way or that way because we're trying to get some sort of certainty as a counter reaction to what's going on in the external environment.
That's right. That's absolutely right. We think we prefer naturally to have some kind of certainty, kind of predictability.
Mm.
We like to make forecasts and we like to have some clarity about where we're heading. I'll give you another example. When I lived in Japan for some time during the financial crisis, and I was working as a financial journalist at that point. And as normally, a company will produce forecasts for their earnings and earnings per share and what have you, maybe the revenue. And at that time, companies just stopped doing those forecasts. They just gave up.
Mm.
They said, we don't know what's going to happen. So we're
Mm.
not going to bother putting those forecasts out. So that's really an example about people just give up thinking about the future. If it seems too chaotic to them, then they just throw their hands up in the air and say, "Do you know what? I'm just not going to bother anymore," which I think is very dangerous because the future's still there and you still have the capacity to think about it more. And I think one of the healthier attitudes that we're also seeing is companies are a little bit more engaging with what is a bit of a niche sort of strategic foresight field to help them think about the possibilities of the future and let go a little bit about that addiction to prediction.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're sticking your head in the sand, isn't it really not thinking about the future? How common do you see that today? I mean, we're sort of getting that into that sort of area today where it's like much more sort of short term focused.
In some areas, but we also have the capacity. Some people are thinking even further into the future because some of the technologies we're encountering now, it's not just about transport or even information. It's really about how we live our lives. And so for some people, it's for those who can really lean into the future and exercise their imaginations. For them, the future is expanding. But for those who are maybe going to be disrupted by that and are going to struggle to come to terms with the consequences, certainly for them, they're going to be hunkering down and looking a little bit more day to day.
And how do we gain that sense of control, though, to avoid doing some of that in terms of gaining control around certainty around what's going on? Because it can be hard to look ahead and say, I really don't know what's going to happen. And it's almost, and that's where you get into this sort of reaction, really. What sort of techniques can we use to start to think about how we manage that kind of stress? Because it adds to stress to a certain extent.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. The human mind likes a little bit of change, a
Mm,
little bit of novelty. Otherwise, we get bored.
mm,
But if we have too much, and it's just too much for us to compute, so we get overwhelmed, and that's stressful. So, in a word, how do you deal with that? In a word, imagination. When you think through what could happen, and you really do spend some time to look at different possibilities, That's how you start to build confidence in understanding what might happen. I can't say it's easy, but when I take people through thinking about various different scenarios, then that's how they say, okay, maybe the future's not so scary anymore. I don't know what's going to happen. I still don't know what's going to happen, but I've thought through the possibilities. I took some people, some other psychologists through an exercise thinking about the future of work
Mm.
and what AI might mean for the future of work. And in general, I can tell you now, organizational psychologists are not that positive about the
Mm.
future of their industry because AI is going to be massively disruptive for that, or potentially could be in the relatively short term. But when you go through the process and actually look, okay, what could happen? Maybe there's going to be more jobs or less jobs. Maybe all these things are going to happen. Then you can say, that's now I understand it. Now I know. Now I have a little bit more control over deciding what I do.
Yeah.
I think the problem is when you haven't thought through it, then it just seems like the future's happening to you and you've lost all sort of agency and control over it.
One of the difficulties you got about thinking about it is it expands hugely, right? So there's so many different scenarios. How do you almost stop making your brain exploding by just trying to think through every single scenario rather than like maybe the major scenarios? And like how much detail do you need to go into, and what kind of level of detail of the different, almost like different scenarios or visions of the future do you think you need to have?
Sure. I think you're absolutely right. When you ask people, when you start talking about the future, their eyes glaze over and it just seems like too
I don't
much.
know what's going to happen.
I-
Yeah.
exactly. So you need to take a slice. So you need to appreciate the fact that most of the future you don't really care about. It's nothing to do with you. There's just many things going on in the world that I either can't control and irrelevant to me. So you need to choose which slice you're going to be interested in. And then you can just work in the uncertainties. What are the drivers of change or uncertainty for that slice of the future? But it is quite subjective. If you're looking at scenarios, how crazy do you get? And it's the litmus test is, are you learning anything by thinking about this particular future? And that's why I encourage people to get into the habit and mindset of thinking more deeply into the future, because then you get a better feel for, okay, this future is pretty unlikely to happen, but let me explore it and see what I can learn from that. I think the presentation that you saw, I talked about COVID
Mm.
and some scenarios we did around COVID. And one of them was about a really doomsday scenario where COVID, we were looking at it in February 2020. So we didn't know much about the disease then, but we were looking, it could be a very severe disease with a high fatality rate and easy to catch. Now, I don't want to think about that. And it wasn't the most plausible scenario, but it was still
Nice
possible.
scenario. Yeah.
And by looking through that, we learned something from it. And also, if things had happened to lean in that direction, we would have been more prepared. So I think it's very subjective. You've got to get a feel for it by keep thinking through scenarios and seeing what you're learning from them.
One of the things that as humans is we all have biases, don't we? To a certain extent, it's like how do you take your own bias, and it could be a bias towards optimism, it could be a bias towards like pessimism as well, but it could be bias against certain things like the pandemic or for the pandemic. Those kind. How do you manage to make sure that you're not introducing that into your different scenarios to try and keep it as objective as possible?
I think we have to accept that we have biases. It's almost a case of which ones do you want to have
Yeah.
today, but which ones do you want to be leveraging today? If possible, you want to stand back from looking at the future and the possibilities and then bring the biases in when you decide, okay, which one's more likely? Which ones do I like? Which ones do I not like? How am I feeling
Mm.
about these scenarios? And when I'm making decisions about what I want, how am I feeling as I'm making those decisions? Am I
Yeah.
feeling happy and optimistic? Am I feeling a bit defensive or angry or worried? So I think it's just I think awareness is really the most important thing. And it sounds like a really soft skill, awareness. So I don't talk about it that much because it's always about how to frame that. But awareness about what's going on and how you're interacting with the world is really the key to that.
Hearing you speak, it's almost like it feels like the process is almost as important as actually whether the prediction is right or not to a certain extent. It's the process, and that makes you feel better about it as much as how accurate it's actually going to be at the end. Does that sort of helps manage the stress or the uncertainty and how that then impacts on your psychology? But because it allows you to have a plan, at least in the back of your mind, around how things might turn out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are no facts about the future. So everything's quite subjective and open to interpretation. So if you can be building confidence in your ability to make good decisions about the future, then you'll feel better about that as well.
Yeah. And what about a lot of people? A lot of people listen to this will have a credit risk background or a risk kind of background. So we all like maths to a certain extent. What about overlaying risk management type of measures in terms of what's the size of the impact and then the probability that's actually going to happen, an estimate of that, which is almost like a value at risk type approach that we would tend to do, particularly in finance or in credit, in the credit world. Can you overlay those kind of things in terms of the likelihood of this particular thing is happening might be low, but the impact of it is huge. Therefore, I need to spend more time thinking about that versus not.
Sure, absolutely. I think so. This is a great question, and I'm going to try and resist the temptation to get too academic on it. But I think when we're talking about risk and the world that perhaps your listeners live in, then there's a lot of modeling and, as you say, a lot of math. So you can calculate some probabilities based on past history and the data up to today. And those models can work very well in up to certain time frames, and then eventually they start to become less useful as time goes by because there are too many variables to consider and too many uncertainties
Yeah.
coming into play. And for some companies, that's fine. Their business is in that short-term time frame, and so they can get away with it. But for other companies, there becomes a little bit more. There's some more risk for the company because they can't see that far ahead into the future, and then it becomes a lot more subjective. But I think it's still important to put the probabilities against this. And the reason why is that when you come to make a decision, and it doesn't matter what kind of decision it is, all decisions involve implicitly some probabilities
Mm.
in your mind. And I'll give you an example. If you decide, okay, what am I going to have for dinner tonight? Okay, maybe I'll have pizza. So then you're having a probability about, okay, you're going to order the pizza from somewhere. Is that pizza going to be good quality pizza like you're expecting? What's the probability of that? And when you get the pizza, is it going to be in good shape? What's the probability of that? And when you eat the pizza, what's the probability that's going to give you the level of satisfaction you imagined 2 hours ago when you were thinking about what to have for dinner?
Mm.
So even simple things have all these probabilities built in there. Now, some people don't like probabilities because they mistake the fact that there's a number in there for some kind of precision or accuracy, which isn't there. It's still only an estimate or a forecast. And definitely and it's just a probability. What actually happens is going to be different from that. But you still need to do it. You still need to have those probabilities in there. Otherwise, you cannot make a decision.
Mm.
So that's why I always promote the fact that we put probabilities against things. It helps with the decision making when we make it explicit.
Yeah, you sent me down a complete rabbit hole around poker. I'm not a poker player, but I think you were recommending around talking about probabilities, which is, I mean, essentially
Yeah.
it's game theory and probabilities that sit on top. These particular group of hands may or may not, depending on the cards that will come up, but are more likely to win than those. And you play with those kind of things. I don't play poker, but I spend an awful lot of time thinking about probabilities as a result of some of the things you were talking about.
Yep, yep. And what are you saying? You're obviously going to a lot of events these days and talking to a lot of people. How are you gauging or sensing the level of uncertainties in various environments?
I think people are uncertain. There's a lot of geopolitical uncertainty at the moment. I think people concerned about that. I think that sort of bleeds through into day to day as well. So it feels like there's like a contagion from what's happening on externally into what's going on almost like in people's day to day. Yeah. The bigger news stories are affecting people's day to day, which is causing people to hesitate. And I think just a very small change will have a big impact when it's multiplied over lots of people. That's what I'm feeling. I'm not sure if that does that kind of resonate with what you're seeing? It feels like people are almost like hesitating to make decisions to a certain extent because there's this uncertainty out there and they don't know really what to do and they're in this wait and see mode, which was why what you were saying really connected because get beyond that foggy future and say, let's have a plan because we know what could happen. So therefore we can move forward based on that and the probabilities to a certain extent.
Absolutely. You'd be amazed, even in the oil and gas industry, right? Which should be planning not just years, but decades ahead.
Mm.
And yet still very much prone to very short term influences in their decision making. And so I think we've seen this year a big slowdown in new investment in oil and gas production after quite a lot last year. But has the long term forecast for oil and gas really changed over the past 6 months? Probably not. But certainly the uncertainty around the short term uncertainties around the economy have changed. And that seems to be really influencing what should be really long term decisions. And so we see this conflict between what should be happening in the long term and what actually we're feeling in the short term. And a lot of futurists don't watch the news because they don't want to be influenced by all that short term influence.
And I suppose does that kind of uncertainty is that what generates some of this procrastination? I mean, procrastination is another way of saying it versus hesitation. And is it like a psychological kind of effect that kind of happens? Well, you've got this going along, so therefore I'm gonna procrastinate. But you can only procrastinate for so long, almost like until the pressure builds up that you have to take a decision. But it's like, how do you stop that? Because it can be quite damaging if you're not taking decisions, particularly investment decisions, right? If you're not investing now, in 2 years' time, you then don't have the equipment, or you then don't have the infrastructure, and then you're behind the curve in terms of like investments that could be made or should have been made as a result. Is that definitely a dynamic that kind of that happens? You're seeing it sort of almost like psychologically.
all the time. I think procrastination is the bad feeling you have when you're
Mm.
sticking with the status quo, even though you haven't really decided to do that. You're just hoping that that's going to be okay. Whereas you'd be much better off to make the decision to stick with whatever you're doing now and then have a review at some point in the future than just leave things hanging. And so it is a definite symptom of uncertainty, what I describe as a psychological allergy we have to uncertainty, second guessing yourself, the procrastination, fear of messing up, for sure.
Yeah. And what about the balance between having a pessimistic outlook? And we tend to really look on these things, particularly on risk registers around bad things that might happen versus good things that might happen as well. So, like personally, we want to believe that it's all going to turn out great. And there's almost like a bias to optimism built in to a certain extent in our culture, to a certain extent. We like people who have optimistic views of the future. However, if we do some of these sort of scenario plannings, it tends to be, well, these are the bad things that might happen because we want to avoid those things happening as well. So we've got this like loss avoidance kind of psychology going on as well. How do we manage that to make sure it's probably balanced? Because probably it's going to be a bit of good and a bit bad that will always come out, I would imagine.
Yeah, for sure. I think the important thing is that the direction needs to be firm. And when I'm thinking about plans, I'm thinking about that firm direction, which is based on a clear vision.
Mm,
When we have an idea about really where we want to be ending up in the long term, then we can be flexible about how we get there. And that can take into account, what happens. And so when you're anchored to that idea, but there has to be frequently revisited. Your vision may well change and alter over time, as long as it's not altering because of some short-term considerations. But then that can give you some positivity about the future. I'd say futurists in general tend to be more positive and more
mm.
optimistic than people who don't think about the future too much, simply because they've thought through things and they've realized it's not as scary as it seems when you're not thinking about it that much. But as long as the plan is not dependent on a prediction and can be flexible enough to take you where you want to go, then you're going to be fine. I mean, they were set up to make it easier to rent movies, right? You used to be able to go to
Oh, yeah.
a DVD or whatever tape rental store to go rent a video, and they did it kind of mail order because their vision was just to make it easier and get rid of late fees and all this other kind of stuff. But of course, to realize that vision, they had to change strategy after a while because no one had DVDs and you could stream things online. And so they changed their strategy and how they could achieve their vision by going with the flow and understanding how the environment had changed.
Mm. And I suppose in the futurist community, to a certain extent, how do you do that horizon scan in terms of really understanding what the latest ideas are or what's coming down the pipe? What could potentially happen? Because you want to try and have that balance of you as much as you can, and particularly if you're doing it externally rather than like for yourself, you don't want to be just reacting on your own fears to a certain extent. What's the best way of really grabbing what some of the other possibilities are that might be happening in 10 years' time?
It's a bit of I say kind of technical process. There's a lot of detail when you're looking. It's a little bit subjective to try to find the regular sources of information because that can be quite time consuming and resource intensive. And there are platforms that help you do that, but trying to find the right sources of information and then almost categorizing them in the right way so you can understand if this is something that's likely to develop in the short term or the long term, which element of the future that it's going to influence, how it's going to play out with other trends or signals that you've seen. And so, yeah, it has to be a structured process to really gather that information and then, most importantly, turn it into or gather that data and turn it into information that can inform your scenario planning or whatever it is, your strategy that's going to be driving you forward in the future.
Well, I was just chatting with someone about this last week. Certainly within the call center operations world, we spend an awful lot of time on the day to day. It's just the nature of the work. However, it's very easy to lose sight of what's going to happen in 3 years' time, what's going to happen in 5 years' time, let alone 10 years' time. And we were just chatting about the importance of just being able to take that almost like 10-year view, right? What could potentially happen? It may not happen, it may not happen, but you've got to have it on your radar screen because this is something that actually might impact us and affect us, and like trying to lift ourselves out of that sort of day to day. we're only going to, in our case, we're only going to take telephone calls. We're not going to look at AI as an example because I don't need to know about it because I don't need to know about it at the moment. But in fact, it could actually impact us in, let's say, a year's time. So it seemed like it was quite important to have that balance, and a lot of firms almost like underinvest in like looking around that 5 year view or the 10 year view. Do you see that when you go in and chat to people and they say, actually, we should have been looking at this in 5 years' time. This is what we've got to be aware of.
Yeah, for sure. Because that 5 year thing almost certainly is not going to happen in the way you imagine it to happen.
Mm,
But some other things are going to happen running up to that. And you can start to get a feeling for the elements of the future. When you create scenarios, say you create 4 scenarios based on some dimension of uncertainty, none of those will happen. And you need to accept that. This is the most difficult thing is we want to predict which one's the right one. And but by doing that, you can see there's elements, there's threads of all of those futures will come back to the present and you can start to see them happening. And by doing that, you can see the commonalities amongst all those scenarios and start to position yourself now and even continue to adjust your position as you've already seen and thought through what could happen. So
mm.
absolutely. But it's difficult to do because when you come into work every day, you've got some things to deal with right now. There's some fires to put out. There's some meetings to go to. And none of it's to do with
Yeah.
what could happen in 3 years' time and whether I'm sensing some of those futures coming about.
Yeah, I really feel that a lot of us were very surprised by ChatGTP or these large language models when they came out just over a year ago or a year or so ago. When in fact, the reality is, if you really knew what was going on, then you would have been talking about language models and you were up in terms of what could be coming through. But had we known, we would have been in a fantastic place in terms of just being able to leverage some of the technology. It just would have been transformational for some companies, I would have thought. So that was a real sort of like illustration for me around like why it's important to be able to be aware of what's coming down the pipe.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That was a step change in what was in front of us, which made it more real. But definitely a lot of companies, if they had thought through what that could mean, if and when that kind of thing happens. And this is one of the challenges. You don't always know when these things are going to happen. But by positioning yourself for it, then you can definitely take advantage of it more quickly than other people.
I think a challenge is also you have a lot of people around you potentially who maybe aren't quite as bought in and say that's never going to happen. You need to get your feet back on the ground, and it's like holding firm and just making sure you stay true to some of that. You're an advocate of it, I know. So it's because it's what you do, but it does feel like that's the importance of it because then at least you're not surprised and you can plan ahead around it. Now, I want to put you on the spot, I suppose, a little bit in terms of if you were to say there was 5 trends that we've got to have on our radar screen, when you look ahead, what do you think? What do you think the big ones are that we really should be thinking about?
The first thing I always think about is cybersecurity. Yeah, that one I worry about because it doesn't, there can't be more things more complex than that. And it's becoming to the stage now where it's almost, it used to be, people used to talk more about viruses than they do now. Viruses as they relate to computer systems. But what's happening now, when something goes wrong, it can go very seriously wrong. And we saw with CrowdStrike, when it wasn't even malicious,
Mm,
how easy it is for stuff to head south.
mm,
And so I think cybersecurity is one of the big issues to look at going forward. You wanted 5, right? Energy, I think, is another one.
mm,
Um, I think it's weird, actually. Even not that many years ago, people were expecting that increasing efficiencies in light bulbs and the way we use stuff was going to result in a decrease in global energy consumption.
mm.
And I'm just like, I don't really get that because we're only making more and more stuff that uses electricity. We're not going to give up energy anytime soon. And of course, now we've got a technology which is massively energy consuming. And of course, now everybody's expecting energy consumption to rise, although probably it's going to be a bit bumpier than some people are expecting. But I think energy, how much we consume and definitely how we produce it is going to be a big question going forward. No, I think food's going to be quite an interesting developing question going forward. We've got increasing technology in food and the way it's produced. And I think that's also ripe for some quite radical changes over the next couple of decades
Mm.
as we get new technologies and also new attitudes towards what we're consuming and what we're putting in our bodies. I think one of the big ones is really healthcare. When we look at the kinds of insights, and we're really only scratching the surface now in terms of how we can understand how your body's different from mine, your microbiome's different from mine, the way you respond to drugs is different from mine, and that we can rather than just do trials where it says, okay, this drug is going to have an effect on a majority of people, why it's going to be different from you and how you can tailor healthcare to individuals in a much more sophisticated way. And that's one of those things is I don't know exactly how that's going to pan out because different elements of that technology are going to advance at different rates and influence in different ways. But I think that's going to be another big trend.
Mm.
I got to four. What's your fifth? So you give me a fifth
I was
one.
going to say, I was thinking about quite a bit about data and about how we're all interconnected. So healthcare is one. And so like, as we get more and more data, we're measuring more things, we can process more data, we start to understand things in more detail. For example, the microbiome, but it can also be around our own sort of personal behaviors. It can be around what's happening in the environment. And like the ability to be able to process that and be able to churn that just makes things much more personalized, but comes with dangers. So things like cybersecurity and those kind of things. But I think that's sort of like personalization, I think is something we're going to see a lot more. And I think it's accelerating in terms of what we can do from an analytical point of view to understand the world around us, almost like it can be beyond what us as humans can comprehend to a certain extent. So I think that'll be a trend, which is we're going to get more data analysis. We're going to have a better understanding around what's going on around us. Although us as individuals maybe won't, it'll be done by the machine to a certain extent. I don't know. I think it's quite exciting time in terms of be able to look at that. But there's some dangers and some risks with it, such as cybersecurity, such as decisions being made when you've got a single point of control. You change something and it has a cascade effect across a wider kind of area as well. I don't know. It's interesting.
Absolutely. I think
One anecdote I was going to say was you must have seen Blade Runner, right? So way back, it's many. I watched it again, and it's the first time I'd watched it since ChatGPT and all this open AI stuff came on, and it was very strange watching it because some of the things that were being talked about were very relevant today in terms of general AI. Sort of those kind of questions were coming up, and it was just a bit of a moment of such an old film that it is now to see how it's almost gone full circle. So I do think things like sci-fi are actually quite interesting in terms of people think a long way ahead on some of these ideas, and they're probably worth having a look at some of those things now in terms of what could potentially happen, and probably doing your scenario planning about how likely it is and when it's going to happen.
for sure. No, I've got much more into sci-fi over the years, and even the Foundation series, which was written I think in the 50s and 60s, seems pretty relevant. The iRobot and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But as you say, actually, your AI agents is something I'm personally quite fascinated in because as we've had more and more information, paradoxically, it's actually made decision making a little bit more challenging because we now have to make decisions about what kind of information we want to make our decision and how much, when we've got enough and what,
Mhm.
everything else. So it's quadrupled the amount of decision making requirements just to make a decision because we have all this information now. And we're like at this sort of trough of decision making ability because we're just drowning in information and we were expected to make more and more decisions. And I'm hoping that we've turned the corner now and that we're going to actually, all of this information is going to be converted into something a bit smarter in the terms in the form of AI agents who can start making some of these decisions on our behalf and take the decision making load off of our shoulders. But you're absolutely right. A lot of risks there and how that's going to turn out is going to be fascinating.
Yeah, I know it's almost like I think we'll have a much more streamlined decision-making process. We'll rely on the machine to actually synthesize a lot of the data. So the data analysis that I would do actually looking at stuff on a spreadsheet, it would be these days, will probably, go away to a certain extent and be replaced by being able to look through a lot more information. The question is what happens under the bonnet to a certain extent. And are you being led in a certain way? Is it correct or not? And maybe having to go back to things. So I think that whole piece is going to be quite an interesting area to explore. Um,
For sure.
I think for sure. So, Graham, thanks very much. Where do you think we go from here? What do you see it in terms of, particularly in terms of the prediction element and the uncertainty element? What do you think are some of the things we got to concentrate on now as organisations to try and contain what we've got and making sure we're making good decisions now going forward?
So I always encourage people to think for themselves. We spend most of our time thinking about the here and now, the next few seconds, or the immediate future, the ultra short term future. And so if I can get people to think another second or another minute or another day into the future, then that's success for me because we can make better decisions. And there are so many factors that are dragging our attention back to this kind of noisy present where we feel most comfortable and we get the sort of dopamine hits and everything else. And so I think as organizations, but as individuals working in organizations, I think we need to try a little bit harder because it's hard, but not that hard to get a better handle on what could happen. We do just need to choose the right slices and not get overwhelmed by it and decide, okay, I want to understand more about this. And it really is about getting into the habit of doing it. Some foresight work, people will tell you maybe it's going to take months to do this thing. We have to have this in depth exploration of the future, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. There's some value in that. But even just ourselves, if we get in the habit of thinking through just a little bit further into the future, what could happen, then we gain confidence but also we get smarter about the decisions and our choices about the future.
Yeah. Well, it's a super fascinating area. Definitely our discussion changed the way I thought about some things for sure. And in terms of the probability element. So I really appreciate you making the time to chat with me. It's a fascinating topic. So thanks very much, Graham.
No, thank you very much, Chris. It's been a great chat.
Thanks.